Hi, Aqua Roomers. It's time for chapter reading. Yesterday was so exciting. So, Pa had gone away, and Jack could tell something was wrong. And finally, when Pa came home riding Patty, Patty was going like the wind. And look what happened. My goodness. 50 wolves. There's a big gray brute. Pa said they were so big, that's what they call buffalo wolves. And they surrounded Pa and Patty, but Pa held Patty, and he made it home, safe and sound. He'd taken a long time because he'd met 2 bachelors, neighbors, and he met a new family that moved in. But oh my goodness, well, Patty was shaking all over and fighting the bit, said Pa. Sweat ran off her. She was so scared. I was sweating too. But I held her down to a walk, and we went walking along among those wolves. They came right along with us, a quarter of a mile or more. That big fellow trotted by my stirrup as if he were there to stay. Then we came to the head of a draw, running down into the creek bottoms. The big gray leader went down into it, and all the rest of the pack trotted down into it behind him. As soon as the last one was in the draw, I let Patty go. She headed straight for home, across the prairie, and she couldn't have run faster if I'd been cutting into her with a rawhide whip. I was scared the whole way. I thought the wolves might be coming this way, and they might be making better time than I was. I was glad you had the gun, Caroline, and glad the house is built. I knew you could keep the wolves out, but Pet and the colt were outside. You need not have worried, Charles, Ma said. I guess I would manage to save our horses. I was not fully reasonable at the time, said Pa. I know you would save the horses, Caroline. Those wolves wouldn't bother you anyway. If they had been hungry, I wouldn't be here to... Little pitchers have big ears, Ma said. She meant that he must not frighten Mary and Laura. Well, all's well that ends well, Pa replied. And those wolves are miles away from here now. What made them act like that? Laura asked him. I don't know, Laura, he said. I guess they had just eaten all they could hold, and they were on their way to the creek to get a drink. Or perhaps they were out playing on the prairie and not paying any attention to anything but their play, like little girls do sometimes. But perhaps they saw I didn't have my gun and couldn't do them any harm, or perhaps they had never seen a man before and didn't know that men could do them harm. So they didn't think about me at all. Pet and Patty were restlessly walking around and around inside the barn. Jack walked around the campfire. When he stood still to smell the air and listen, the air lifted on his neck. Bedtime for little girls, Ma said cheerfully. Not even baby Carrie was sleepy yet, but Ma took them into the house. She told Mary and Laura to go to bed, and she put baby Carrie's little nightgown on and laid her on the big bed. And then she went outdoors to do the dishes. Laura wanted Pa and Ma in the house. They seemed so far away outside. Mary and Laura were good and lay still, but Carrie sat up and played by herself in the dark. In the dark, Pa's arm came from behind the quilt in the doorway, and quietly he took away his gun. Out by the campfire, the tin plates rattled, then a knife scraped the spider, Ma and Pa were talking together, and Laura smelled tobacco smoke. The house was safe, but it did not feel safe because Pa was outside with Ma, and there was no door. There was only the quilt. After a long time, Ma lifted the quilt. Baby Carrie was asleep then. Ma and Pa came in very quietly and very quietly went to bed. Jack lay across the doorway, but his chin was not on his paws. His head was up, listening. Ma breathed softly, Pa breathed heavily, and Mary was asleep too. But Laura strained her eyes in the dark to watch Jack. She could not tell whether the hair was standing up on his neck. Suddenly, she was sitting straight up in bed. She had been asleep. The dark was gone. Moonlight streamed through the window hole, and streaks of moonlight came through every crack in the wall. Pa stood back in the moonlight at the window. Right in Laura's ear, a wolf howled. She scringed away from the wall. The wolf was on the other side of it. Laura was too scared to make a sound. The cold was not in her backbone only, it was all through her. Mary pulled the quilt over her head. Jack growled and showed his teeth at the quilt in the doorway. "Be still, Jack," Pa said. Terrible howls curled all around inside the house, and Laura rose out of bed. She wanted to go to Pa, but she knew better than to bother him now. He turned his head and saw her standing in her nightgown. "Want to see them, Laura?" he asked softly. Laura couldn't say anything, but she nodded and patted across the ground to him. He stood against the wall and lifted her up to the window hole. And there, in the moonlight, sat half a circle of wolves. They sat on their haunches. They looked at Laura in the window, and she looked at them. She had never seen such big wolves. The biggest one was taller than Laura. He was taller even than Mary. He sat in the middle, exactly opposite Laura. Everything about him was big. His pointed ears, his pointed mouth with the tongue hanging out, and his strong shoulders and legs, and his two paws side by side, and his tail curled around the squatting haunch. His coat was shaggy gray, and his eyes were glittering green. So this is what Laura saw when she looked out the window. And do you see the big fella right in the middle? Mm-hmm. And that is part of a whole circle of wolves that went all the way around the house. My goodness. Laura clutched her toes into a crack of the wall, and she folded her arms on the window slab. She looked, and she looked at that wolf, but she did not put her head through the empty window space into the outdoors where all the wolves sat so near her, shifting their paws and licking their chops. Pa stood firm against her back and kept his arm tight around her middle. "He's awful big," Laura whispered. "Yes. And see how his coat shines?" Pa whispered in her hair. The moonlight made little glitters in the edges of the shaggy fur all around the big wolf. "They are in a ring clear around the house," Pa whispered. Laura pattered beside him to the other window. He leaned against that wall and lifted her up again. And there, sure enough, was the other half of the circle of wolves. All their eyes glittered green in the shadow of the house. Laura could hear their breathing. When they saw Pa and Laura looking out, the middle of the circle moved back a little way. Pet and Patty were squealing and running inside the barn. Their hooves pounded the ground and crashed against the walls. After a moment, Pa went back to the other window, and Laura went too. They were just in time to see the big wolf lift his nose till it pointed straight at the sky. His mouth opened, and a long howl rose toward the moon. Then, all around the house, the circle of wolves pointed their noses toward the sky and answered him. Their howls shuddered through the house and filled the moonlight and quavered away across the vast silence of the prairie. Now, go back to bed, little half-pint, Pa said. Go to sleep. Jack and I will take care of you all. So Laura went back to bed, but for a long time she did not sleep. She lay and listened to the breathing of the wolves on the other side of the log wall. She heard the scratch of their claws on the ground and the snuffling of a nose at a crack. She heard the big gray leader howl again and all the others answering him. But Pa was walking quietly from one window hole to the other, and Jack did not stop pacing up and down before the quilt that hung in the doorway. The wolves might howl, but they could not get in. Pa and Jack were there. So at last, Laura fell asleep. Whew, that was a big adventure. And we're already on chapter 8. 2 stout doors. Stout is strong. And there's a picture of Pa. He's walking Pet and Patty to the creek to get a drink. Laura felt a soft warmth on her face and opened her eyes into the morning sunshine. Mary was talking to Ma by the campfire. Laura ran outdoors, all bare inside her nightgown. There were no wolves to be seen. Only their tracks were thick around the house and the stable. Pa came whistling up the creek road. He put his gun on its peg and led Pet and Patty to the creek to drink as usual. He had followed the wolf tracks so far that he knew they were far away now. They were following a herd of deer. The Mustangs shied at the wolves' tracks and pricked their ears nervously, and Pet kept her colt close at her side. But they went willingly with Pa, who knew there was nothing to fear. Breakfast was ready. When Pa came back from the creek, they all sat by the fire and ate fried mush and prairie chicken hash. That was breakfast. Pa said he would make a door that very day. He wanted more than a quilt between them and the wolves the next time. I have no more nails, but I'll not keep on waiting till I can make a trip to Independence, he said. A man doesn't need nails to build a house or make a door. And then we will read how Pa makes the door. And remember, the reason that they have to live so close to a creek is that's their source of water for drinking, for washing, for cooking. Exactly. So, until next time, great chapter reading. Bye, boys and girls.